Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. In this video I'm going to show you my gouache collection and explain a little bit about the pigments, what I think about them, and why I have them in my collection. First off, I would like to show you my palette. This is my gouache palette, and I'll use most of my gouache paints from dry, as you can see here, but I also sometimes use palette paper instead if I need to keep the pigments really pure. But gouache, since it's water-based, you can squeeze it out and let it dry just like watercolor, and then reactivate it with water to use it when you're painting. So I really enjoy using gouache like that. And so my palette is all of my pigments combined basically, and it does look like a bit of a mess, but that also helps me get a lot of useful neutrals. First off, I have here Venetian red, and this has become my favorite red recently. It's a very toned down red, and I find it gives a very classical feeling to a painting. It's more of a natural looking red, and I really enjoy the color that it gives. I find it's also really useful when mixing in with green to make darker complements for foliage or anything that was red originally. It's just overall a really nice pigment, and I enjoy it a lot. It's not the first red you would think of, but I highly recommend it. Next up is Cad Red Light. Cadmiums are well known for being dangerous, and of course you don't want to expose your skin to this for extended periods of time. But the nice thing with gouache is it is water-based. You can wash your hands, no big deal. But you really do need some cadmiums in your palette because they're the brightest reds you're going to get and brightest yellows. So my favorite is Cadmium Red Light because it's the most intense of the cadmiums. So I recommend it a lot, and you really can't get around it. You need a bright red. Next up, I have Opera Rose, which is a bit of a silly pigment. You don't really need this. I don't really need this, but if you ever need to paint anything that's super neon, like very hot pink, you can't mix that. You just can't. You have to use a synthetic pigment like this. So I have this in my collection. It's tons of fun. Do I use it a lot? Totally not, but it's really fun. It's really nice. Next up here I have Perylene Violet. So this isn't really a red, but I've included it in my warm colors here. It's a super, super dark plum, basically, and I like to use it as my darks in particular paintings, depending on the color scheme, but I've just really enjoyed this color. I'm on my second tube now. Ever since I picked it up in the first place, I've been really amazed at just how dark it is, but how rich the color is as well. I really enjoy this, and if you're looking for sort of a non-conventional color, check out Perylene Violet or Perylene Maroon. They're pretty much the same, but what I have is Perylene Violet, and I give it an A+. Next up here we have Quinacridone Red, which is going to be your cool red. So really, I don't use this a lot, but sometimes you end up painting something from life or thinking of a color in your head, and the only possible way you can get it is by using a cool red like Quin Red, and that's why I have this around. It's not my favorite. It's pretty transparent, but sometimes you just need it, and that's reason enough to have it around. Alright, next up we're going to move into the yellows and browns. The first one here is Marigold Yellow, which really, it isn't yellow, it's orange, and you can definitely mix orange with other colors. You can just get red and yellow, that's totally fine. But if you need a really pure color, you don't want to spend time mixing, which sometimes you don't. If you're painting from life or if you're painting something plein air, you don't want to be fussing over your colors that much. And so this is a nice shortcut, really, and that's why I have it in my collection. Do I use it a lot? No. But is it helpful? Totally. Next, I have your classic primary yellow. You could use cadmium yellow. You could use gamboge if you want. You can use lemon yellow, whatever you want, but you do need a bright yellow with any set of colors. And most starter sets will always give you a bright yellow. You don't use it by itself mostly, but it's one of those things you just can't get around. You need it for mixing in. Next up here is Naples yellow, which I really like. Again, it's another one of those sort of classical feeling pigments. It's more neutral than the primary yellow, that's for sure. But Naples yellow is really nice. It's really, yeah, it's creamy and it's neutral enough. So I like mixing it into my other colors to soften them up. I like using it as underpainting. Overall, very nice pigment. Highly recommend. I also have here yellow ochre, which is a nice golden color, and you can't really beat this pigment. You can't replace it. It's so nice. And I didn't have it for the longest time, and I was always painting and thinking, man, I wish I had yellow ochre. Something about it is just very luminous. It has a good quality to it of light, and yellow ochre is good. Next up, we have raw sienna, which is similar to the yellow ochre, but as you'll see in the swatch, it does go a bit darker and more ruddy. I just like this a lot. You can make a very similar color by just mixing burnt sienna and yellow ochre, but I love tubes of brown. I love having lots and lots of options at my brush tip. Next up is burnt sienna, classic brown, very reddish. I find it's less of a bright orange like you would think from burnt sienna watercolor. That ends up being a lot more depthy and foxy and nice. In gouache, it's a bit more just like a matte red, but it's still really nice to have around, especially for painting fur and different types of stone or bark. Having that reddish brown already right there without mixing it is very handy. Of course, you mix it into other things. I'm not saying use your pigments straight out of the tube, but it's nice to have tons of options around on your palette to mash together. And then, of course, we have burnt umber, which you always need. It's the dark brown. Burnt umber is going to give you that rich, earthy pigment that you need for pretty much everything neutral that you're going to paint. So definitely make sure if you're just starting out, get burnt umber. Or if you're already painting in gouache and you don't have burnt umber right now, put it on your shopping list. Now we're going to move into my green paints, which I have a few of. The first one here is called Linden green, and it's like a highlighter yellow. I keep making paintings with it, and then people will call it a yellow painting, even though in my head it's green, because this tube of paint is kind of ambiguous that way. But I find it super useful for painting foliage with the light coming through, or if you think about green magic, to me, this is the color of green magic if you're making any sort of fantasy paintings. I've found that this tube has been really useful to me, and I'm on my second tube already. So this is a really cool color that if you've never heard of it, please try it out. I think it's a really great color, really punches up your greens. Next up, my favorite color. This is, well, favorite green anyway. This is Hooker's green. And it's so dark and not too bright and not too saturated. For me, it's the perfect green. It's what I use as a base for mixing any other greens. And I really enjoy the qualities that it has. I've enjoyed it basically across the board in every type of paint. In acrylic, it's my favorite green. In watercolor, it's my favorite green. I don't have it in oils, but I do have it in gouache, and I use this one more than any other greens. I find it very nice. similar to the hooker's green is the olive green, but this one's just not as dark, and it's definitely more saturated. I thought it would be just as useful for foliage, and it would be if you were doing very bright paintings, but I don't do a lot of bright greens in this sense, not saturated Kelly greens. So I do have a tube of olive green, but I haven't actually been using it very much. Maybe it's going to be your thing, but it's not really my kind of thing. Here we have Viridian, which is a very handy pigment in very specific situations, especially, and this is just because I've been doing it a lot recently, painting iridescent feathers on birds like magpies and stuff. You're going to need a really bluish green like Viridian. And Viridian is separate from phthalo green in that it doesn't go quite as dark when you put it onto the page. So I also have a tube here of Phthalocyanine green, which is, it opens up to be similar to the Viridian, but it goes way, way darker. This is great for doing washes on rivers or lakes or glacial streams or anything like that. You're going to want this very like icy green. And here is a very expensive tube of paint. This is Cobalt Turquoise Light, and I love this color. I use it very sparingly because it was quite pricey here in Canada. But this is a color that you don't really need. You can make a very similar color by mixing your phthalos and some white, but I just really like this tube. It was a treat to myself. If you're going to treat yourself and you need a $30 Canadian tube of gouache, this one's really pretty. Cobalt Turquoise Light. And moving into the blues, I have, of course, a tube of cerulean blue. You're gonna need this, it's the quintessential blue. It's the partner in crime to ultramarine blue. Very classical pigment. So I have it in my collection, and you should have it in yours. I also have a tube of sky blue designer's gouache, which really looks very similar to the cerulean blue. I had the tube of sky blue before I bought the tube of cerulean. They're basically the same. I'm just keeping the tube of sky blue around until I use it up. So that's why it's here. I don't recommend this too highly because it's basically the same as cerulean without being made of cerulean. Here we have ultramarine blue, which is the most important and most useful blue, I say. What is there to say about ultramarine? If you've ever painted anything, you've probably used ultramarine. And in gouache, it's very, very opaque, very rich, and almost violety. I mix this in with lots of stuff. It's always on my palette. And I have actually 2 tubes on the go right now. Here we have the Phthalocyanine blue, which you'll also need, like I said, with the phthalo green and Viridian for iridescent bird feathers or anything that's really got a turquoise sheen on it or a real glossy blue undertones like icebergs. Icebergs are actually mostly the phthalo green, but I have Phthalocyanine blue, and it starts off really dark and opens up to be very transparent. It's a cool pigment. I don't use it that much because it's not a blue that I gravitate towards, but if I'm doing stuff from life, sometimes it's the only thing that does the job. Here I have a tube of black. You're always just going to need black. Don't use too much black because it can deaden your colors, but depending on what you're working on, and if you've built up enough colorful under layers like washes and stuff, you can use black without wrecking it, but black is the darkest you will get with gouache, and even Payne's Gray, which I use a lot, doesn't get as dark as black. Here's the tube that I use much more often and that I really, really love, Payne's Gray. Highly recommend this. It's a cool black, basically, and it's super useful, and you should really basically be using this way more than your blacks because it'll just add a lot more richness and color to your painting while still being very dark. One of my professors told me about Payne's Gray when I was in art college, and it basically improved my paintings right away, just having this color. So I highly recommend Payne's Gray. Pick it up. Here we have my whites. You don't need both usually. Like I have permanent white, which is also known as titanium white, and I also have zinc white. They're pretty much the same. There's very slight differences. The zinc white is a little goopier. Could also just be the brand in this case, but it's a little bit goopier and a little bit warmer. And by a little bit, I mean like a minuscule amount. Like I really had to think about it to figure it out, but you don't need both whites, but you do need white. And if you can get the big tubes of white gouache, definitely do that because white is always what you're going to run out of the fastest because you're mixing it into everything you do. So there's my whites. And I also have a tube here called Neutral Gray number 3 from Winsor Newton. I bought this recently and I've really been liking it because it makes getting to a neutral state really, really fast. Do you need this tube? No, not really. But I'm really enjoying it. It's really interesting to have it around. I've really been liking the quality that it gives to my colors that I'm mixing. And that is the entirety of my gouache collection at the present moment. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope to get a video about my watercolor collection up sometime soon, as well as a couple more sketchbook flip-throughs. But thank you so much for watching. My channel is super new, so if you would like and subscribe, that would really help me out, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments below.